This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and military operations depicted are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. This story is not affiliated with or endorsed by the U.S. Navy or Department of Defense. 3 years, and the dog still waited by the door every night for a dead man to come home. Colton Briggs woke at 4:30 in the morning the same way he always did. Not from an alarm, not from sunlight, but from a sound that had no name. A low whimper, soft as breath through a cracked window, rising from somewhere near the bedroom door. He lay still for 3 seconds, eyes open in the dark, his body running through the old checklist before his mind fully surfaced. Sounds, exits, threat level. Then the whimper came again, and the checklist dissolved into something older than training. He pushed the blanket aside and lowered his feet to the cold pine floor. The cabin was dark except for the faint blue glow of pre-dawn light pressing through the curtains. Across the room, a German shepherd lay curled at the foot of the closed bedroom door, his black and tan coat barely visible in the shadows. The dog's legs twitched. His paws flexed against the floorboards, as though running through terrain that only sleep could reach. A third whimper, higher this time, almost a word, broke from the dog's throat, and his ears flattened tight against his skull. Colton crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside him. He did not turn on a light. He placed one hand flat on the dog's rib cage and held it there, feeling the rapid heartbeat settle beneath his palm. "Easy, Coda," he said quietly. His voice dropped to something lower and softer than the voice he used with anyone else in the world. "Easy. You're here." Coda's eyes opened. For a moment, they were unfocused, still trapped in whatever dark corridor the dream had taken him. Then the dog's nose twitched, found Colton's scent, and the tension drained from his body in a long exhale. He shifted his weight and pressed his head against Colton's thigh. They sat like that for a while. A man and a dog in a dark room, breathing together, waiting for the dream to lose its grip. Outside, the Blue Ridge Mountains held their silence the way they always did before dawn, as though the whole valley were holding its breath. Colton scratched behind Coda's ear. The dog's tail moved once against the floor. A single thump, the quietest possible acknowledgement of comfort. Then Coda turned his head back toward the bedroom door, and his nose settled into the gap beneath it, pulling in air from the hallway beyond. He did this every night, not guarding, waiting, as though someone might still walk through that door, smelling of dust and sweat and the particular chemical scent of cleaning solvent on a well-maintained weapon. Colton watched the dog's nose work the gap, and something behind his sternum tightened the way it did every morning, a knot that no amount of pulling could undo. He left the bedroom door open every night. Not for himself. The routine never changed. By 4:45, Colton was on the cabin's back porch, hands chalked, gripping the pull-up bar he had bolted to the crossbeam 2 years ago. The mountain air in late October carried a bite that sank through his t-shirt and settled into his joints. He pulled himself up, exhaled, lowered, pulled again. His right shoulder protested on the third rep, a deep, grinding stiffness that lived in the rotator cuff and woke up angry every morning. Old injury from a fast rope insertion that had gone sideways 7 years back. He never talked about it. He just worked through it until the joint loosened enough to function. The way he worked through most things. Coda sat at the edge of the porch, ears forward, scanning the tree line in the gray light. The dog's posture was upright and alert, a mirror of the man on the bar, both of them running their own version of a morning watch, both of them looking for something that was no longer there. By 5 o'clock, they were running. The trail behind the cabin climbed steeply through a corridor of oaks and hickories that had turned every shade of fire in the past 2 weeks. Leaves the color of rust and copper littered the path, crunching softly beneath Colton's boots and Coda's steady paws. The dog ran at a precise heel, close enough that his shoulder occasionally brushed Colton's left knee, a habit from training that neither of them had ever broken. Colton's left knee clicked on every uphill stride, a dry popping sound like a knuckle cracking under pressure. 19 years of running with heavy loads on sand, rock, mud, and concrete had ground the cartilage down to something that worked, but never stopped complaining. He ignored it the same way he ignored the shoulder, by moving forward until his body remembered that pain was not the same as damage. The trail crested at a clearing on the ridge above the town. From here, on a clear morning, the valley opened up below like a painting someone had started but never finished. Patches of mist still clinging to the low ground, the rooftops of Laurel Creek just visible through the trees, the steeple of the old stone church catching the first pale light. It was a small town, quiet, the kind of place where people waved from their trucks and did not ask questions they did not want answered. That was why he had come here. Coda sat beside him at the overlook, ears rotating, cataloging the sounds of the valley waking up. A truck engine on the road below, a door slamming somewhere in town, a crow calling from the ridge to the north. The dog processed each sound and dismissed it. No threat, no interest. And then returned his gaze to Colton with the patient, steady expression of an animal who had learned that his job was simply to be present. Colton rested his hands on his knees and looked out at the valley. The air tasted like wood smoke and wet leaves. Somewhere in town, someone was already burning oak in a fireplace. Just another day, boy, he said. The words came out the way they always did. Flat, practiced, aimed more at himself than at the dog. A daily recitation. A small lie that got him from the ridge back down to the cabin, from the cabin to whatever piece of furniture needed fixing for whoever was paying, and from the work site back to the cabin again, where the silence waited, along with a dog who still slept by a door, dreaming of footsteps that would never come. The Granger job took most of the morning. Ed Granger was 72, a retired postal worker with a roof that leaked in 3 places and a wife who reminded him of this fact at a volume that carried across the yard. Colton had been patching the roof in sections over the past week, replacing rotted cedar shingles and resealing the flashing around the chimney. It was the kind of work that kept his hands busy and his mind in a narrow lane. Measure, cut, nail, repeat. He preferred it to anything that required conversation. Coda waited in the bed of the pickup truck below, lying on a folded moving blanket with his head on his paws, watching the road with the calm vigilance of a sentry who trusted his post. Every so often, Colton would glance down from the roof and find the dog's eyes already on him, checking, confirming. By noon, the worst section was done. Colton packed his tools, collected a check that Ed Granger handed over with a gruff nod, and none of the small talk that other clients attempted, and climbed back into the truck. His left knee barked as he stepped down the ladder, a sharp, bright pain that shot up through his thigh and then faded to the usual dull ache. He paused on the bottom rung, shifted his weight, and continued without expression. The drive back to the cabin took 12 minutes along a 2-lane road that wound through the lower slopes above town. The trees arched overhead in a tunnel of gold and crimson. Colton drove with the window cracked, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on Coda's back, where the dog sat in the passenger seat. He did not play music. He did not listen to the news. The only sound in the cab was the engine and the soft rhythm of Coda's breathing. The cabin appeared through the trees the way it always did, a small structure of weathered pine logs set back from a gravel clearing, with a covered porch that Colton had rebuilt himself during the first winter. It sat at the end of a private road that petered out into forest 50 yards past the property line. No neighbors within sight. No reason for anyone to drive this far unless they were lost or looking, which was why the woman sitting on his porch steps stopped his breath for half a second. Colton's foot came off the gas. The truck rolled to a slow crawl. His eyes went to the figure first. Female, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, seated on the second step with a manila envelope in her lap. Then his eyes went to the dog. Coda was already pressed against the passenger window, his tail swinging in wide, rapid arcs. A low whine climbed from his throat. Not the warning sound, not the alert, something else entirely. Before Colton had fully stopped the truck, the dog was pawing at the door, his body trembling with a recognition that made no sense. Colton parked, cut the engine. He sat there for a moment, watching through the windshield as the woman on the porch noticed the truck and stood. She was tall, lean, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans that suggested she had driven a long way. Her face was composed but uncertain, the expression of someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say but was no longer sure of the words. He opened the passenger door. Coda launched from the truck before Colton could reach for the leash. The dog covered the distance to the porch in 3 strides and did something that Colton had never, not once in 3 years, seen him do with a stranger. Coda pressed his entire body against the woman's legs, buried his nose in her hands, and whimpered. Not the nightmare whimper, not the anxious whimper. A sound that came from somewhere deeper. A sound like recognition, like reunion, like grief and joy tangled together in a single breath. His tail swept the porch boards. He rucked his muzzle into her palms, inhaling in long, desperate pulls. And when she knelt down and put her arms around his neck, the dog went still. Completely still. As though he had found something he had been searching for since the night the bedroom door stopped opening. Colton stood by the truck, his hand still resting on the open door, and watched. His chest was doing something he did not have a name for. Coda did not approach strangers. Coda did not seek contact. Coda tolerated the world outside this cabin with the same controlled distance that Colton did, because they had both learned the same lesson from the same loss. The woman looked up. Her eyes were dark brown, direct, and already red at the edges. "Are you Colton Briggs?" she asked. He did not move from the truck. "Depends on who's asking." She stood, one hand still resting on Coda's head. The dog stayed pressed against her leg, as though magnetized. "My name is Nora Mercer," she said. "Jack was my brother." The name hit him the way sounds hit him in the dark. Sudden, total, cutting through every layer of defense he had built over 3 years and landing somewhere he could not protect. His hand tightened on the truck door until the metal edge bit into his palm. Nora held up the manila envelope. It was thick, creased at the corners, the kind of envelope that had been opened and closed many times. "We found Jack's things in storage 2 months ago. My parents had moved, and the boxes got lost in transit. They only turned up when my father died, and we cleared the house." She paused. Her voice was steady but thin, the way a wire is steady before it snaps. "Jack left this. There are files, notes, things I don't understand, military reports, and a letter." She turned the envelope over. On the back, in handwriting that Colton recognized the way he would recognize his own heartbeat, were 5 words. "If anything happens, find Briggs." Colton stared at the handwriting. Jack's handwriting. The same tight, angular print that had filled logbooks and after-action reports for 8 years. The same hand that used to sketch tactical diagrams on scraps of cardboard during briefings, quick and precise, while everyone else was still reading. "He said you were there," Nora continued, "that you'd know what his notes meant. I'm a lawyer, Mr. Briggs. Civil litigation. I can read a contract, but I can't read whatever Jack was writing about. Operational briefs, sector reports, I don't know what any of it means. I just know something in those pages didn't sit right with him before he died." She held the envelope toward him. "I need your help understanding how my brother really died." Between them, Coda whimpered softly. His head turned from Nora to Colton and back again, his amber eyes moving between the two people as though trying to close a circuit that had been broken for 3 years. Colton looked at the envelope, looked at the handwriting, looked at the dog who had not left this woman's side since the moment he caught her scent. Then something behind his face closed like a door. "I don't talk about that," he said. His voice came out level, practiced. A wall built from 4 words and 19 years of training in how to contain things that did not belong in daylight. He whistled once, short, low, and pointed toward the cabin door. "Coda, fuss." The dog's ears flattened. He looked at Colton, then at Nora, then at Colton again. For 3 full seconds, the German Shepherd did not move, caught between a command and an instinct that ran deeper than obedience. Then, slowly, with a reluctance that was visible in every step, Coda turned away from the woman and walked to Colton's side. Colton opened the cabin door, and the dog went in. Colton followed. He did not look at Nora again. The door closed. On the other side, in the dim hallway, Coda turned and lay down facing the door. He pressed his nose to the gap at the bottom and breathed in. Long, slow, steady pulls of the scent that lingered on the porch like a handprint on glass. The scent of someone who smelled like a ghost. The manila envelope haunted the next 24 hours the way a word sits on the tip of the tongue. Present, unresolved, demanding attention it had not been given. Nora Mercer did not leave Laurel Creek. She checked into the Ridgeline Inn, the only lodging in town, a narrow 2-story building on the main street with a faded sign and window boxes that someone had filled with autumn mums. The room was clean, small, and looked out over the street, where pickup trucks angled into parking spots outside the hardware store and the diner, and a real estate office that appeared to have been closed for several years. By the next morning, She was sitting in a corner booth at the Copper Kettle, a cafe 3 doors down from the inn, with Jack's files spread across the table in front of her. The Copper Kettle was the kind of place that existed in every small town in the Blue Ridge. Pine-paneled walls, mismatched chairs, a glass case of baked goods by the register, and a chalkboard menu that had not changed its offerings since the Clinton administration. The air smelled of dark roast coffee and something with cinnamon. At the counter, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose was drying mugs with a dish towel and watching Nora the way small-town people watch strangers. Not unkindly, but with the quiet awareness that the ecosystem had shifted. "You're not from around here," the woman said eventually. It was not a question. Nora looked up from the files. "Is it that obvious?" "Honey, the last person who sat in that booth with a stack of papers that thick was the IRS auditor a few years back, and he did not look nearly as tired as you." The woman extended a hand across the counter. "Margaret Holt. Everyone calls me Maggie. I own this place, and I know everyone who walks through that door. Which means I don't know you." Nora shook her hand. "Nora Mercer. I'm here looking into something related to my brother. He passed away a few years ago." Maggie's expression shifted. The practiced sympathy of someone who had lived long enough to know grief on sight. "I'm sorry to hear that." She set her towel down and leaned both elbows on the counter. "Was he from around here?" "No. But someone who knew him is." Maggie studied her for a moment. She had the look of a woman who had spent decades reading the people who sat at her counter. The hunters who came through in November, the hikers who got lost on the ridge trails in summer, the locals who nursed their coffee through long winter mornings because the cafe was warmer than going home. She tilted her head slightly. "You wouldn't happen to be looking for the quiet one with the dog, would you?" Nora's hand stilled on the papers. Maggie picked up a fresh mug and began drying it with slow, circular motions. "Comes in here sometimes, orders black coffee, sits at the counter with his back to the wall, always the same seat, the one that faces the door. Stays about 15 minutes and leaves. Never orders food. The dog waits outside by the front step like a statue carved from granite. I've tried talking to him, Lord knows. In 2 years, I've gotten maybe 40 words out of him, and I'm being generous with the counting." She held the mug up to the light, inspected it, set it on the shelf. "Decent tipper, though, and once, when the pipe under my sink burst during the February freeze, he showed up the next morning with a wrench and fixed it before I even opened. Never said who told him." She reached for another mug. "Seems like a decent man. But whatever he's carrying it alone." Nora said nothing for a long moment. She looked down at her brother's handwriting on the files, the sharp, angular letters that she used to see on birthday cards and the occasional postcard from places he could never name, and thought about a man who would not open his door and a dog who had pressed against her legs as though she were the answer to a question the animal had been asking for 3 years. The next morning, the air had turned. A cold front had come down overnight from the north, pushing the temperature into the low 40s and turning the mist in the valley into a thin, bitter haze. Nora was back at the Copper Kettle by 8, the files arranged in stacks she had organized by date, a lawyer's habit, imposing order on chaos. She was reading Jack's handwritten notes for the 3rd time, trying to make sense of abbreviations she did not recognize. when movement outside the window caught her eye. A man and a dog crossing the street. Colton Briggs walked the way she had noticed certain men walk, with an economy of motion that made every step look deliberate, as though the ground had been assessed and cleared before his boot touched it. He wore a dark canvas jacket, work boots, and a thermal shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows despite the cold. The German Shepherd moved at his left side in a perfect heel, shoulder to knee, matching his stride without a leash. They were heading past the cafe. Then Coda's head turned. The dog's nose came up first, catching something on the air that drifted through the cafe's partially open door. Then, his body angled toward the building, pulling gently against the invisible line of the heel command. Colton shortened his stride, stopped. He looked at the cafe door, then at the window where Nora sat looking back at him. Their eyes met through the glass. The moment held for 2 seconds, long enough for Nora to see something flicker behind his expression, something that wanted to move toward the door, and something else that held it in place. Then Colton turned away and continued walking. Coda held his ground for 1 beat longer, his eyes still on the window, before turning to follow his handler down the street. Nora exhaled slowly and looked back at the files. Among the pages, one of Jack's handwritten notes had been circled twice in blue ink. The pen pressed so hard, it had nearly torn through the paper. 3 words and a question mark. Intel feels wrong. Below that, in smaller writing, a note that Nora had read 4 times without understanding. Contractor changed the brief 2 hours prior. Original brief flagged hostile activity in sector. New brief, clean. Who authorized? And at the bottom of the page, underlined twice, a name she had never heard her brother mention while he was alive. Dominic Hale. Nora turned her pen over in her fingers. She opened the legal pad she carried everywhere and wrote the name in her clean, precise handwriting. Then, she added the question that had brought her 600 miles from Richmond to a small town in the mountains where a man would not open his door and a dog recognized the scent of a family that no longer existed. Jack knew something was wrong before he went in. He wrote it down, and nobody ever read it. The sound came without warning. Colton was in the cabin's back room, fitting a shelf into the bookcase he had been building for the past week. Pine boards, dovetail joints, no screws. The kind of slow, precise work that kept his hands occupied while his mind ran its loops. Coda lay in the doorway, chin on paws, watching with the drowsy patience of a dog who had memorized every sound his human made. Colton set the shelf in place and reached for the wooden mallet. He tapped once, twice. On the 3rd strike, the mallet glanced off the edge of the board and cracked flat against the bare pine surface of the workbench. The sound, sharp, concussive, echoing off the close walls of the small room, filled the cabin like a flashbulb. Colton's hands stopped. His vision narrowed. The room dimmed at the edges, the pine walls dissolving into something darker, closer. A corridor that smelled of concrete dust and copper and the chemical residue that hangs in the air after a detonation has finished rearranging the world. He was not in the cabin anymore. He was walking point. Night. The hallway stretched ahead of him in grainy shades of green through the night vision. Walls on both sides, doorways at irregular intervals, the texture of the ceiling telling him the space was old, built decades before the conflict that had turned it into a tactical problem. His breathing was controlled, measured, a metronome keeping time beneath the weight of his plate carrier. Behind him, close enough to touch, the rest of the element moved in a stack. Jack Mercer was second in the formation. Colton could hear his breathing. Calm, steady. The breathing of a man who had done this enough times to know exactly how afraid to be and exactly how to file that fear into a compartment where it could not reach his hands. Radio crackle. The voice of the officer in charge, tight and expectant. "Briggs, what do you see?" Colton scanned. The hallway terminated in a T intersection. Left corridor dark. Right corridor dark. No movement. No heat signatures leaking from behind the doors. The intel brief had been clear. Sector confirmed. No hostile presence expected at this location. A soft target. In and out. "Clear," Colton said into the radio. His voice was flat, professional, a single word that carried the weight of every decision that would follow. The element advanced. Two-man stack through the intersection. Colton went left. Jack followed. Then the world split open. The flash came first. White. Total. A wall of light that turned the night vision into a searing blank. Then the sound. A detonation that hit Colton's chest like a fist and threw him sideways into the corridor wall. His helmet struck concrete. Shrapnel. He did not see it, only felt the hot line it drew across his right side, low along the ribs, the kind of sensation that registers as pressure before the nerve endings have time to translate it into pain. He hit the floor. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard shouting, fragmented, overlapping, the controlled chaos of operators reacting under fire. He tried to push himself up, and his right arm buckled. The shrapnel had done more than scratch. Then Jack's voice on the radio. Close, strained, breaking up. "Briggs, contact. I'm..." Silence. Not the silence of a radio cutting out. The silence of a frequency that had gone empty. "Jack!" Colton pressed the transmit button. His own voice sounded distant, muffled, as though coming from the far end of a very long hallway. "Jack, respond!" Nothing. Jack. Nothing. The corridor smelled of dust and copper, and something else that Colton would never be able to scrub from his memory, no matter how many pine shelves he built in a cabin 1,000 miles away. The flashback released him the way it always did, not gradually, but all at once, like a hand opening. One moment, he was in the corridor. The next, he was sitting on the cabin floor, his back against the workbench, his t-shirt dark with sweat. His right hand was shaking. His breathing came in short, shallow pulls that he could hear echoing off the walls of the small room. Coda was there. The dog had left his spot in the doorway and was pressed against Colton's side, his nose touching Colton's open palm with a gentle, insistent pressure. Not licking, not pawing, just the warm, steady contact of a nose against skin. A living thing saying, in the only language it had, "You are here. You are here. You are here." Colton closed his hand around Coda's muzzle and held on. His breathing slowed. The room reassembled itself. Pine walls, sawdust on the floor, the half-finished bookcase, the mallet lying where it had fallen. October light through the window. The mountains outside. The present. "Good boy," he whispered. His voice was raw. "Good boy." Coda exhaled through his nose and settled his weight more firmly against Colton's leg, and they sat there on the floor of the cabin while the clock on the wall ticked and the world outside went on without them. 20 miles away, in a room above the main street of Laurel Creek, Nora Mercer stood in the doorway of her hotel room and knew immediately that something was wrong. The door had been locked. The lock was undamaged. But the room behind it had been rearranged by hands that did not belong to her. The changes were small. The kind of changes that a less observant person might not have noticed. The zipper on her overnight bag had been moved from the left side to the center. The stack of legal pads on the desk had been shifted. Still stacked, still aligned, but rotated 15 degrees from where she had placed them. The closet door, which she always left open because she had never liked closed closet doors, was shut. Nora stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds. Her heart rate climbed, but her expression did not change. 8 years of depositions and courtroom cross-examinations had taught her how to keep her face still when her body wanted to react. She stepped inside, checked the bathroom, checked behind the curtains, and confirmed the room was empty. Then she went to the desk. The manila envelope was there. The files were there. Whoever had been in the room had looked through them. Several pages were out of sequence, a pattern she had memorized, but had not taken anything. A message, not a theft. Someone wanted her to know they had been here. Someone wanted her to know they could come back. Nora sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against her knees. Her hands were shaking, but when she looked down at them, her mind was already doing what it had been trained to do. Assessing, sorting, constructing a timeline. No forced entry meant a key card or a skill. The hotel was small, 2 staff members at most. No security cameras she had noticed. Whoever did this was not a random opportunist. They knew she was here, knew which room, knew when she would be gone. She looked at the files, at the name she had underlined in her legal pad. Dominic Hale. 2 days ago, that name had been nothing, a scribble in her dead brother's notes. Now, someone had walked into her room without breaking a lock, touched her things without taking them, and left a silence that was louder than any threat she had ever received in a courtroom. Nora picked up the envelope. Her grip was steady now. She was a lawyer. She had seen intimidation before. A construction firm CEO who had his people follow her to the parking garage. A corporate defendant who mailed photographs of her apartment building to her office. She had not flinched then, and she would not flinch now. But those cases had been about contracts and liability clauses. Those cases had not been personal. This was about her brother. About a man who had written her name in a letter she received 3 years too late. About the last thing Jack Mercer ever put on paper before walking into a hallway that someone, somewhere, had decided would be his last. She looked out the window at the road that led toward the mountains, toward a cabin at the end of a gravel road where a man lived with a dog that had recognized her before the man would. The streetlights of Laurel Creek cast pale circles on the wet pavement below. The town looked quiet. But quiet, Nora was beginning to understand, did not mean safe. Tomorrow she would go back, not to ask about Jack, to tell Colton Briggs that whoever did not want her asking questions had just given her the only reason she needed to keep asking them. The only person who could answer them had just shut his door in her face. But doors, Nora had learned, could be opened more than once. She came back at mid-morning, driving the rental car up the gravel road with the windows down, and no rehearsed speech this time. The air smelled of pine resin and decaying leaves. That particular October scent of the mountains letting go of summer, one tree at a time. Colton was on the porch, sanding a replacement board for the front step, when the car appeared through the trees. Coda saw it first. The dog's ears went forward, his tail began a slow wag, and a soft whine built in his throat. Colton's sanding stopped. He watched the car approach with the expression of a man calculating variables. Nora parked and got out. She did not carry the envelope. She did not mention Jack. She climbed the porch steps, and before Colton could speak, she said, "Someone went through my room at the inn last night. The lock wasn't broken. Nothing was taken. But my files were moved." Colton's expression changed. The guarded distance she had seen yesterday did not disappear, but something sharper rose behind it, an alertness that tightened the muscles around his eyes and straightened his posture by a fraction of an inch. It was the look of a man whose training had just been activated by a familiar sound. "Lock was intact?" he asked. "Clean. No damage. Anything missing?" "No, but the pages in the envelope were out of order. Someone read them." "Who knows you're here?" "No one. I didn't tell anyone where I was going." "You told the hotel your name when you checked in." Nora paused. "Yes." "Credit card?" "Yes." "Then someone knows." He stood, set the sandpaper on the railing, and looked past her toward the road. His eyes tracked the tree line the way they tracked every room he entered. Methodical, unhurried, cataloging the geometry of threat and distance. Coda had positioned himself at the top of the porch steps, facing outward, his body still except for the slow rotation of his ears. Colton looked at the dog, looked at the woman, made a decision with the speed and economy of someone who had spent 19 years making decisions that did not allow for hesitation. "You're staying here," he said. He did not explain. He did not offer alternatives. He opened the cabin door, disappeared inside, and came back 40 seconds later with a set of sheets and a pillow. Spare rooms at the end of the hall, bathrooms on the left. Nora studied him for a moment. Whatever she saw in his face was apparently sufficient, because she nodded once, went to the car, and returned with her bag and the manila envelope. She set the envelope on the kitchen table. The thick package sat there between them, Jack's handwriting visible on the back, the words, "Find Briggs," catching the light from the window. Beside it, partially hidden by the edge of the larger envelope, was the smaller fold of paper, sealed with tape. The handwriting on that one was different, smaller, more careful, as though the person writing had taken extra time with each letter. "For Briggs. Only if he asks." Colton's eyes moved to it, held there. Something shifted in his jaw, a tightening that pulled the muscle along his cheek. Then he turned away and walked to the spare room. He returned with the sheets and began making the bed with the crisp efficiency of a man who had been making racks since he was 18. Hospital corners, no wrinkles, the pillow placed exactly centered. The discipline of it was automatic, something his hands knew how to do when the rest of him was still deciding whether the thing happening in his kitchen was real. When he came back out, Nora was standing by the window, looking at the tree line. The afternoon light came through at a low angle and caught the side of her face. And Colton noticed for the first time that she had the same jaw as Jack. The same way of holding her chin slightly lifted, as though preparing to meet whatever came next head on. He noticed, and he looked away. "Spare room's ready," he said. "Bathroom's on the left. I'll be up early. Coda and I run at 5. Door stays locked." Nora turned from the window. "Thank you." Colton nodded once, a short, downward motion that ended the conversation. He moved to the kitchen and began making coffee, his back to her, his hands steady on the familiar routine. The sealed letter sat on the table 3 feet from his right hand. He did not touch it. He did not look at it again. Nora watched him go. She did not mention the sealed letter. She did not ask him to read it. Jack had written the instructions clearly, and she was a woman who respected the wishes of the dead, even when those wishes made everything harder for the living. That night, as the cabin settled into its familiar darkness and the October wind moved through the trees outside, Coda left his usual post by the bedroom door and padded down the hallway. He stopped at the spare room where Nora slept, circled once, and lay down across the threshold, with his nose pointed inward, his body forming a barrier between the hallway and the woman inside. No command had been given, no hand signal, no word in German or English. The dog had simply decided, in whatever calculus a German shepherd uses to measure loyalty and instinct and the scent of someone who carried the same ghost he did, that this person needed guarding. From the hallway, barely visible in the dark, Nora's voice came softly through the crack in the door. She was not speaking to Colton. She was speaking to the dog, or perhaps to the memory the dog carried. Jack used to say you'd know a good man by how his dog treated strangers. The words drifted down the hall and reached Colton where he stood in the darkness outside his own bedroom, one hand on the doorframe, his body still, his breathing stopped. He stood there longer than he should have. Then he walked back into his room, and for the first time in 3 years, he turned the deadbolt on the front door of the cabin, locking in what he had spent every night since Jack's death trying to lock out. Morning arrived with the smell of coffee already made and the sound of a dog's nails clicking on pine floorboards. Nora came down the narrow hallway to find the kitchen table transformed. Colton sat at the far end, the seat that faced the door, she noticed, with the manila envelope open and Jack's files spread in front of him, not scattered, arranged. He had separated the pages into 3 stacks with the same quiet precision she imagined he brought to everything. Official documents on the left, Jack's handwritten notes in the center, maps and diagrams on the right. A mug of black coffee steamed near his elbow. His reading glasses, cheap drugstore frames that looked slightly too small for his face, sat low on his nose. He did not look up when she entered, but he spoke. "Sit down." 2 words, not an invitation. A decision that had already been made somewhere between the deadbolt turning last night and the coffee brewing this morning. Nora sat across from him. Coda lay beneath the table between their feet, his chin resting on Nora's shoe, his tail making a single slow sweep across the floor when she reached down and scratched behind his ear. "I don't know what most of this means," Nora said. She pulled her legal pad from the stack and opened it to the page of notes she had taken at the copper kettle. "I can follow the dates. I can follow the structure. It reads like a case file, a sequence of reports leading up to an event. But the terminology, the abbreviations, the operational context, That's where I need you. Colton picked up the first page from Jack's handwritten stack and studied it. His eyes moved across the text with the focused economy of a man who had read thousands of after-action reports and operational briefs, not word by word, but in blocks, pulling the meaning out of the military shorthand the way a mechanic reads an engine by sound. This is a pre-mission intelligence summary, he said. Sector assessment, threat level, force disposition. It's the document they give the platoon before an op. Tells you what to expect on the ground. He turned the page over. The official version says the sector was confirmed clear. No hostile activity expected. He set it down and picked up Jack's notes. Your brother's version says something different. Nora leaned forward. What does it say? Colton read aloud, his voice flat and careful, as though the words were something fragile that might break if handled wrong. Contractor changed the brief 2 hours before. Original brief flagged hostile activity in sector. New brief, clean. Who authorized? He set the note down and looked at Nora for the first time that morning. Jack was saying that someone altered the intelligence report before the op. The original brief said the area was dangerous. The version the platoon received said it was safe. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a breeze moved through the oaks and sent a scatter of dry leaves across the porch. Coda shifted his weight beneath the table, his ear turning toward the window, processing the sound and dismissing it. What does that mean? Nora asked. In practical terms. It means we walked into a sector we were told was empty, and it wasn't. The sentence sat between them the way certain sentences do, not because of what they contain, but because of everything they do not. Colton's voice had not changed. His hands were still, but something behind his eyes had shifted. A depth charge that had been sinking for 3 years, finally touching the bottom. Nora watched him. She did not push. 8 years of depositions had taught her that the most important things people said came in the silences after the questions, not during them. Colton picked up another page. Jack's handwriting, smaller now, the letters tight and pressed, the way writing gets when a hand is moving faster than the thoughts can organize. Something doesn't sit right, brother. He stopped reading. His jaw worked once, a small motion that pulled the muscle along his cheek. He said that to me, the night before, sitting on a crate, checking his gear. Colton set the page down. I told him we go with what we got. A micro flashback, no longer than a breath. Jack's face in the blue-white glow of a headlamp, his hands moving over the buckles of his plate carrier with the automatic ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times. The way he looked up. The way his eyes held a question that his mouth did not ask. And Colton's voice, steady, certain, wrong. We go with what we got. The memory released him. He was back in the kitchen. Coda's nose pressed against his ankle beneath the table. I never read the official report, Colton said. After. They told me what happened. An officer came to the hospital and said it was nobody's fault. Sometimes intel is wrong. I believed him. I already knew whose fault it was, and it didn't require a report to confirm it. He looked down at his hands. I was point man. I called the hallway clear, and it wasn't. That was enough. Nora let the silence hold for a count of 5. Then she reached across the table and turned one of the official pages to face him. You called it clear because the brief said it was clear. Look at this. She pointed to a line on the typed report. Intel confirmed no hostile presence.
That's what they gave your platoon. But Jack's notes say the original brief, the one from earlier that day, said the opposite. She tapped the page. Someone changed the document that told you what to expect. You called it the way you saw it, and you saw it the way they showed it to you.
Colton stared at the page. His breathing had changed. Slower. Deeper. The breathing of a man whose body was preparing for something his mind had not yet caught up to. 3 years of weight pressing down on a single point. And now, for the first time, the point was moving. "Who?" he said. Nora turned the note over. At the bottom, underlined twice in Jack's handwriting, the name she had first seen at the copper kettle. Dominic Hale. Coda lifted his head from Nora's shoe and looked at Colton. The dog's ears rotated forward. His amber eyes held steady on his handler's face, reading the shift in posture, the change in breathing, the way Colton's hands had gone still on the table. All the signals that a German shepherd catalogues without being taught. The silent language of a bond forged in years of shared vigilance. "Jack wrote that name and underlined it twice," Nora said. "Do you know who he is?" Colton was quiet for a long moment. Then something surfaced in his expression. Not recognition exactly, but the shadow of it. A face glimpsed across a base, a voice heard in a briefing room, a man who did not wear a uniform, but moved through the same spaces as those who did. "Contractor," he said slowly. "I remember the face. Civilian, but he had access. Showed up at briefs, talked to the command staff. I never knew his role. Point men don't ask questions about the intel chain. We receive the brief, and we execute. I spent 3 years blaming myself. What if someone counted on that?" The question hung in the air of the small kitchen. Outside, the wind picked up and pushed a branch against the cabin wall with a sound like knuckles on wood. Coda's ears tracked it, dismissed it, returned to Colton. Nora opened her legal pad and wrote the name in her clean handwriting beside the notes she had already made. Below it, she began a timeline. Dates from the official report, dates from Jack's notes, the 2-hour gap between the original brief and the altered version. A lawyer building a case with the tools she had. The sealed letter sat at the edge of the table, untouched. For Briggs, only if he asks. Colton's eyes moved to it once, then away. Not yet. Not yet. Nora worked through the afternoon with the quiet intensity of someone who had spent a career turning confusion into structure. She commandeered one wall of the cabin's living room, taping pages in chronological order, drawing lines between dates, circling the inconsistencies that Jack had flagged. Colton sat in the chair by the window and provided context when she asked, translating the military terminology into language she could use, explaining the chain of command for intelligence distribution, identifying which documents would have been generated by whom. He gave her facts, short, precise, stripped of emotion, the way he gave everything. By late afternoon, Nora had enough to form a picture. She stood back from the wall and folded her arms. "Dominic Hale," she said, "civilian contractor, provided intelligence support for operations in the region, had access to pre-mission briefs and the authority, or at least the opportunity, to alter them before distribution." She traced the timeline with her finger. The original brief
generated earlier that day, identified hostile activity in the sector. Hale's revised brief, distributed 2 hours before your platoon deployed, removed that warning. Your team went in expecting an empty building. It wasn't empty. Colton said nothing. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped loosely in front of him, watching her the way he watched everything, with the still assessing patience of a man who had been trained to let information accumulate before acting on it.
"I need to know more about him," Nora continued. "Current status, business connections, anything public." She pulled her laptop from her bag. "That's my territory." She worked at the kitchen table while Colton went outside to split firewood, the kind of task that required just enough physical focus to keep the hands busy while the mind processed something larger. The axe rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Coda lay on the porch, watching the tree line, occasionally turning his head toward the sound of Nora's fingers on the keyboard inside. Within an hour, Nora had pulled enough from public records and business filings to sketch a profile. Dominic Hale, 53, founded a security consulting firm 18 months after the mission that killed Jack. The firm held contracts with several government agencies, board memberships, speaking engagements at defense industry conferences, the kind of professional surface that gleamed with respectability and discouraged questions. She called Colton inside and showed him the screen. "This is him?" Colton looked at the photograph on the company website. The face had aged, but the architecture was the same. Square jaw, close-cropped gray hair, a smile that did not reach the eyes. "That's him." His company's first government contract was awarded 6 months after Jack died, Nora said, from the same agency that oversaw the region where your platoon operated. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Colton straightened slowly. His right shoulder clicked, an audible pop that he ignored, the way he ignored all the small betrayals his body offered on a daily basis. "He didn't just walk away," Colton said. "He got paid." Nora nodded. Whatever happened with that intelligence brief, it didn't end his career. It started one. Coda, who had followed Colton inside, walked to the kitchen table and sat beside Nora's chair. The dog placed one paw on her knee, a gesture so deliberate, so unlike the controlled distance he maintained with everyone except Colton, that both of them noticed it. Nora rested her hand on the paw. Coda's tail swept the floor once. Outside, the sun had begun to drop behind the ridgeline, turning the valley into a bowl of amber and long shadow. The oaks along the trail had gone from gold to copper to something close to the color of dried blood. Colton made a phone call that evening. He sat on the back porch with Coda beside him, the phone pressed to his ear, his voice dropping into the cadence that belonged to a different life. Direct, clipped, the verbal shorthand of men who had once trusted each other with things that could not be explained to anyone outside the circle. "Need a favor," Colton said. "Hale. Dominic Hale. Whatever you can find." A pause on the other end, then a voice, older, careful, with the slight rasp of someone who had spent too many years breathing things the human lungs were not designed for. "That's a name I haven't heard in a while." Another pause. "You sure about this, brother?" "Roger. Give me a day, maybe 2. And Briggs? Yeah. Watch your 6. The line went dead, Colton lowered the phone and looked at Coda. The dog sat with his back straight, ears forward, staring into the trees where the last light was bleeding out of the sky. There was nothing in the tree line. Coda was simply doing what he always did, watching, waiting, keeping vigil over a perimeter that existed as much in instinct as in geography. "Good boy," Colton murmured. His hand found the spot behind Coda's left ear, the place where the fur was softest, where a light scratch would make the dog's eyes half close with something that looked, in the right light, like peace. The next 2 days passed in a rhythm that neither of them had planned, but both of them fell into with surprising ease. Mornings, Colton ran the ridge trail with Coda, while Nora sat on the porch with coffee and the legal pad, organizing evidence with the methodical discipline of a woman building a case she intended to win. When Colton returned, breathing hard, the left knee audibly protesting the final descent, they would sit at the kitchen table and work through another section of Jack's files. Nora asked questions. Colton answered them. The silences between the questions grew shorter. The coffee grew stronger. What Nora noticed first was not the answers, but the way they were delivered. Colton did not explain things the way a teacher would, building context, layering background, leading the listener toward understanding. He spoke the way a man strips a weapon, direct, efficient, each piece removed and set down in the order it mattered. When she asked what a particular acronym meant, he told her in 4 words and moved on. When she asked about the chain of custody for intelligence documents, he drew a diagram on the back of an envelope. 3 boxes, 2 arrows, a circle, and pointed. Brief starts here, gets approved here, reaches the platoon here. Somewhere between these 2 boxes, the document changed. Nora studied the diagram. In a courtroom, that's called tampering with evidence. In the field, Colton said, it's called getting people killed. The words sat in the room like a stone dropped in water. Through it all, Colton's habits revealed themselves in small, involuntary ways that Nora began to catalog the way she cataloged evidence. Not because she was building a case, but because the details formed a pattern, and the pattern told a story the man himself refused to tell. He checked the windows before sitting down. He positioned his chair so that the front door was always in his line of sight. His sidearm, which she had not seen until the second morning when it appeared on the table beside his coffee mug as naturally as a set of keys, went back into the drawer when he caught her looking at it. But she noticed that the drawer stayed unlocked. He was not afraid. He was operational. There was a difference that Nora was only beginning to understand. Afternoons, Colton worked on the cabin. There was always something that needed repair, a board that had warped, a hinge that had loosened, the unending conversation between a wooden structure and the mountain weather that tested it. Nora would hear the sound of a saw or a sander from the spare room where she had set up her laptop, and she would find herself pausing to listen, not to the tool itself, but to the steadiness of its rhythm. A man who fixed things because fixing things was the only prayer he knew how to say. One afternoon, Colton was replacing a section of porch railing. The old board came free with a groan, and as he lifted the new one into position, his thermal shirt rode up on the right side, exposing a line of scar tissue that ran along his lowest ribs. 4 inches of raised pale skin that cut across the tan like a sentence written in a language only the body could read. Nora was sitting on the porch step with her laptop, cross-referencing public filings, and she saw it. A sharp, involuntary intake of breath that she could not stop in time. Colton looked down. His expression closed the way a shutter closes. Fast, total, leaving nothing visible behind it. He pulled the shirt down with one hand and picked up the hammer with the other. He did not look at her. He did not explain. The scar disappeared beneath the fabric, as though it had never been there, as though the night that created it had never happened, as though the man wearing it had not spent 3 years pretending the same thing. Nora did not ask. She returned her eyes to the screen and typed a search query about defense contractor licensing requirements in Virginia, and neither of them mentioned what had passed between them in that half-second of exposed skin and averted eyes. Coda lay between them on the porch, his chin on his paws, his eyes moving from one to the other with the patient expression of a dog who understood more about the people around him than either of them understood about themselves. His tail rested flat against the boards. His ears were relaxed. In the silent arithmetic of the dog's world, whatever was happening between these two was not a threat. It was something else, something that required patience and proximity, and the simple act of being present while the humans figured out what they were not yet ready to name. That evening, after the sun had dropped behind the ridge and the first stars appeared through the bare canopy of the oaks, Colton and Nora sat on the porch in the 2 wooden chairs he had built the previous winter. Coda lay between them, his body stretched across the boards like a warm, breathing bridge. Nora held a mug of tea in both hands and looked up at the sky. The stars over the Blue Ridge were different from the stars over Richmond. Closer, sharper, unchallenged by city light. They filled the sky with a clarity that made the darkness feel less like absence and more like depth. Jack always said the stars looked different from the other side of the world, she said quietly. He'd write about it sometimes, in the letters, how the constellations were the same, but the angle was wrong, like looking at a familiar face from a direction you'd never seen before. She took a sip of tea. He said he missed these ones, the ones over Virginia, the ones we used to watch from the backyard when we were kids.
Colton was quiet for a long time. He looked up at the sky, the same stars, the same ancient and indifferent light that had shone down on every place he and Jack had ever been, from the grinder at Coronado to the rooftops of cities whose names he could not say aloud. The sky did not care who looked at it or why. It simply went on.
He talked about you,
Colton said finally. The words came out rough, as though they had been sitting in his throat for a long time and had grown edges.
Not a lot.
Jack didn't talk a lot about anything personal, but enough. Enough to know he missed having someone to call. Nora's fingers tightened on the mug.
I should have called more. I kept meaning to. I'd put it on my calendar. Call Jack. And then a deposition would come up, or a client emergency, and I'd push it to the next week. And then the next. Her voice thinned. He wrote me letters every month. Every single month. And I couldn't pick up the phone. She did not look at Colton. She looked at the sky. His last letter ended the way they all did, she said. God keeps the ones he needs close. That was his line, his sign-off. I used to roll my eyes at it when I was younger. Jack was always the one with faith, always the one who believed things happened for a reason. I was the lawyer. I believed in evidence.
She set the mug down on the arm of the chair. I'd give anything to get one more letter with that line in it. Between them, Coda lifted his head. His amber eyes moved from Nora to Colton and back, reading the shift in the air the way he read every shift, with the quiet attention of a creature whose survival had always depended on knowing what the people around him were feeling before they felt it. He set his chin down again, this time on the edge of Colton's boot, and exhaled through his nose. A long, slow breath that carried the weight of a dog who had been holding a vigil for 3 years and was only now beginning to understand that the vigil might take a different shape than the one he had been keeping. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The silence was not empty. It was the kind of silence that two people share when they have both lost the same person and are only beginning to understand that the loss, however different in shape, lives in the same place. Colton looked at the dog lying across both their feet. For 3 years, Coda had slept by the bedroom door. Every night, the same position, nose to the gap, waiting. And tonight, here on the porch, with the stars over the Blue Ridge and the scent of the woman who smelled like the man Coda had been waiting for, the dog's eyes were closed. Not the restless, twitching sleep of the nightmares, the deep, even breathing of an animal who, for reasons the human mind could only guess at, was at rest. He hasn't had a nightmare in 2 nights, Colton said quietly. It was the first time he had offered information that was not a response to a question. It was the first time he had spoken about something that mattered without being asked. Nora looked at the dog, then at Colton. She did not say what she wanted to say. She said something simpler. Maybe he knows something we don't. Colton did not answer, but he did not stand up and go inside either. He sat in the chair he had built with his own hands, beneath the stars that Jack had missed, beside the woman Jack had sent. And he stayed. For 3 years, staying had been the hardest thing. Harder than Hell Week. Harder than any op. Staying in a room. Staying in a conversation. Staying in a life that had gone quiet in all the places that used to matter. Tonight, on the porch, with the dog asleep and the stars bright, and the woman beside him who carried her own version of the same wound, staying did not feel like the hardest thing. It felt like the only thing that made sense. The phone rang on the second evening. Colton picked up on the first ring. Coda's head came up from the floor. Nora looked up from the kitchen table, where she had been cross-referencing Hale's corporate filings with the timeline of Jack's deployment. The voice on the other end spoke for 4 minutes without interruption. Colton listened with the phone pressed tight against his ear, his face giving nothing away. When the voice finished, Colton said 2 words. "Copy, thanks." He set the phone down and stood by the window for a long moment, looking out at the dark tree line. Coda rose and moved to his side, sitting in the precise position he always took, left hip against Colton's leg, facing outward, ears forward. Hale's name came up in another investigation 2 years ago, Colton said without turning from the window. A separate inquiry into contractor misconduct in the same region. Witnesses were identified. Depositions were scheduled. The investigation was shut down before anyone testified. Someone with enough pull to make it disappear made it disappear. Nora set her pen down. Who shut it down?
He didn't know, or couldn't say, but his exact words were, "He's not someone you poke with a stick, Briggs." The cabin was quiet. The fire in the hearth popped once and settled. Coda's ear rotated toward the sound, dismissed it, and returned to the darkness beyond the window. Colton turned from the window. His eyes moved to the kitchen table, to the files spread across its surface, and then, for the first time since Nora had placed it there 3 days ago, to the sealed letter that sat at the edge, untouched. For Briggs, only if he asks. He walked to the table, picked it up, turned it over in his hands. The paper was slightly yellowed at the fold, and the tape that sealed it had gone brittle with age. Jack's handwriting on the outside, the smaller, more careful version, each letter placed with deliberate attention, the handwriting of a man who knew that what he was writing might be the last thing he ever wrote. "What's in this?" Colton asked. His voice had changed, lower, stripped of the controlled distance he wore like armor, the voice beneath the voice. Nora looked at the letter. "I don't know. I didn't open it. It was meant for you." A beat of silence. Coda had moved from the window to Colton's side. The dog sat perfectly still, his nose lifted slightly, pulling in the scent of the paper. The room seemed to narrow. The fire, the files, the 2 people, the dog, and a letter from a man who had been dead for 3 years. "He knew me better than anyone," Colton said. "If he wrote this, there's a reason." He broke the tape. The paper unfolded with a small, dry sound. Coda's reaction was immediate. The dog's entire body went still. Then a whimper rose from deep in his chest. Not the sharp, anxious sound of his nightmares, but something lower. Something that seemed to climb from the place where instinct and memory and love are stored in the same wordless vault. Coda pressed his nose to the paper in Colton's hands, inhaled once, twice, and then sank to the floor at Colton's feet and lay flat with his chin on his paws, his body trembling with the recognition that 3 years of absence had not erased. The scent of Jack Mercer. Still alive in the paper. Still alive in the oils his fingers had left on the pen. Colton stood holding the letter, looking down at the dog who had spent every night since the funeral sleeping by a door, waiting for the man whose scent was now rising from a piece of paper like a ghost stepping into the room. Nora pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes had filled. Colton read. The letter was 2 pages, front and back, written in Jack's angular hand. It began the way Jack began everything, without preamble, without softness, straight to the center of whatever needed saying. Briggs, if you're reading this, it means Nora found you. Good. That's what I told her to do. She's stubborn enough to actually do it, which is the only reason I'm writing this, instead of just hoping for the best. First things first. Coda. Take care of my boy. He snores and he steals socks, and he thinks every stick on the ground is a personal gift from God. But he's the best thing I ever did right. He'll follow your lead because he trusts you, and he trusts you because I trust you. Don't let him sleep on the bed. He'll try. He'll win. Let him win. Second, the files. If the files are with this letter, it means I didn't make it back, and I didn't get the chance to bring what I found to someone who could do something with it. I don't know everything yet, but I know enough to know the brief was wrong, and I know it wasn't an accident. Read the notes. You'll see what I saw. You're the smartest point man I ever worked with. You just won't admit it because you'd rather hit things with a hammer. Third, and this is the part you won't want to hear, so I'm putting it last because you're stubborn enough to stop reading if I put it first. If I don't come back, it wasn't your fault. You won't believe that. I know you. You've already decided it was your call, and your call was wrong. And nothing anyone says will change that, because you're Colton Briggs, and you'd rather carry the world on your back than let anyone help you hold it. But here's the truth. You called it the way you saw it, and you saw it the way they showed it to you. The brief said clear. You called clear. That's not a mistake. That's a man doing his job with the information he was given. The mistake was made before you ever set foot in that hallway, by someone who changed the information and never told you. Don't carry this, brother. You've carried enough. Jack P.S. God keeps the ones he needs close. I think that includes stubborn senior chiefs who don't know when to stop blaming themselves. Colton finished reading. He did not move. He stood in the kitchen of his cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains with a dead man's letter in his hands and a dead man's dog at his feet, and the world held still. Then he set the letter on the table, turned, and walked out the front door. He did not slam it. He did not speak. He simply left, the way a man leaves a room when staying in it for one more second would mean breaking apart in front of someone who is not yet allowed to see the pieces. Coda looked at Nora, looked at the door. His ears swiveled forward and back, caught between the instinct to follow and the instinct to stay. Then he rose, shook once, a full-body tremor that started at his ears and rippled down to his tail, and went after Colton. The door swung shut behind him. Nora sat alone at the kitchen table. The letter lay open in front of her, Jack's handwriting filling the space where Colton had been standing. She read the last line again. God keeps the ones he needs close. The same words that had ended every letter Jack had ever sent her. The same words she had taken for granted when he was alive and would have traded everything she owned to hear one more time. She did not cry for herself. She cried because she had just watched her brother reach across 3 years of silence and put his hand on the shoulder of a man who had been drowning. And she understood, with the sharp, undeniable clarity of a woman who had arrived too late for one goodbye, and just barely in time for another, that Jack had known. He had known what Colton would do to himself. He had known, and he had written the antidote, and he had sealed it in an envelope and trusted her to carry it to the one place it needed to go. Outside, on the porch steps, Colton sat with his face in his hands. Coda pressed against his side, warm, solid, unmoving. The dog did not whimper this time. He was silent, the way only a creature who understood loss could be. His chin rested on Colton's thigh, and his eyes were open, watching the dark tree line, keeping watch over the one person he had left. Colton did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark, the letter open in front of him. Coda stretched along the floor beside his chair. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a low bed of embers that pulsed orange in the silence, and the only other light in the cabin came from the moon through the window, a thin, cold band of silver that fell across the table and turned Jack's handwriting into something that looked almost alive. He read the letter again and again, each time the same words, each time the same voice rising off the page. Jack's voice, dry and direct and laced with the particular brand of affection that men in the teams expressed by insulting each other. You're the smartest point man I ever worked with. You just won't admit it because you'd rather hit things with a hammer. Colton could hear it. Could hear the exact cadence, the slight pause before the punchline, the way Jack's mouth would have twitched at the corner while his eyes stayed serious. The last paragraph sat in the center of his chest like a stone. You called it the way you saw it, and you saw it the way they showed it to you. 3 years. 3 years of waking at 4:30. 3 years of running the ridge in the dark. 3 years of building things with his hands, because his hands needed something to hold that was not the memory of a hallway and a radio going silent. 3 years of carrying a weight that Jack, with the calm certainty of a man writing from the other side of a door he knew might not open again, had told him to set down. And he could not. Not because the letter was wrong. The letter was right. Colton knew it was right the way he knew the sound of his own heartbeat. The intel had been changed. The brief had been altered. The information he acted on had been a lie. He was not the one who made the mistake. But he was the one who had survived it. That was the part the letter could not fix. Not the guilt of the call. The guilt of the breathing. Of the waking up. Of the mornings and the coffee and the dog and the slow, stubborn continuation of a life that Jack no longer had. Coda shifted on the floor, and a small sound escaped the dog's throat. Not a whimper, not a dream, a sigh. The deep, resonant exhalation of a large animal settling into the particular kind of sleep that comes only when the creature has decided, at some level below thought, that the person beside it is not going to leave. Colton looked down at the dog. Jack's dog. The dog who had waited by the door every night for 3 years, and who, tonight, was sleeping on the kitchen floor beside the table where the letter lay. He placed his hand flat on Coda's ribs and held it there, feeling the steady rise and fall. "You forgave me," he whispered into the dark room, "and I can't even." The sentence stopped, not because he chose to stop it, but because the place it was going had no words, only a shape, a hollow, a space where language ended and something older and less manageable began. He sat there until the embers died and the moon moved past the window and the first gray hint of dawn began to press against the glass. By morning, Colton had rebuilt himself. Nora came down the hallway to find the kitchen table cleared, the files stacked neatly, 2 mugs of coffee waiting. Colton stood at the counter with his back to her, his posture straight, his movements precise.
He looked the same as every other morning, controlled, capable, contained. Only his eyes gave anything away. They were rimmed with red, and the skin beneath them was darker than usual. And when he turned to set a mug in front of her, he did not quite meet her gaze.
"We need to finish this," he said. 2 days' worth of stubble had turned his jaw into something rougher than the man who had first opened the cabin door to her. His voice was level, but there was a current beneath it. Not anger, not grief. Something closer to resolve. The sound of a decision that had been forged in the hours between midnight and dawn. Nora sat down. She did not ask about last night. She did not mention the letter. She pulled her laptop from the side table and opened it. "I've been tracing Hale's corporate filings since I got here," she said. Her voice shifted into the focused, analytical register that Colton had begun to recognize as her courtroom mode, the version of Nora that organized chaos for a living. His security consulting firm was incorporated 11 months after Jack's death. First government contract awarded 6 months after that. From the same agency that managed operations in the region where your platoon was deployed. She turned the screen toward him. Since then, 12 federal contracts, 4 subcontracts with defense firms, annual revenue in the 7 figures. He sits on 2 advisory boards and speaks at defense industry conferences. She clicked to another page. But here's what took me 3 days to find. His original firm, the contractor operation he was running when Jack was alive, dissolved 2 months after the mission. No public reason given, just closed. The personnel records are sealed, but the financial disclosures aren't, and they show a significant payout to Hale as part of the dissolution. He walked away with enough to fund the new company without outside investment. She closed the laptop and looked at Colton. This isn't just about what he did that night. It's about what he built afterward. The new company, the contracts, the reputation. All of it is built on a foundation that includes a dead seal and a cover-up that nobody ever questioned. Colton's hands rested on the table, motionless. Coda sat beside his chair, ears forward, watching Nora with the focused attention of a dog who could sense the shift in the room's energy the way a compass needle senses north. "You built a case," Colton said. Nora met his eyes. "It's not complete. A courtroom needs witnesses, and the only witness to the brief change is Jack, and Jack is..." She stopped, took a breath. "But it's enough to give an investigator a roadmap. Combined with Jack's notes and the official report, there's enough inconsistency to open a formal inquiry." A sound from outside, faint, distant. The hum of an engine on the road below the cabin. Coda's head snapped toward the window. His ears went rigid and his body tensed. The loose, resting posture replaced in an instant by something harder and tighter. The coiled readiness of a dog whose instincts had been sharpened by years of living with a man who noticed everything. A low growl built in Coda's chest. Not loud, not the barking aggression of a dog protecting territory. Something deeper. A vibration that started behind the ribs and traveled upward through the throat without ever fully becoming a sound. The kind of growl that said, "I hear something that does not belong here." Colton was already on his feet. He moved to the window without haste, but without wasted motion. his body angling to the side of the frame, the way a man positions himself when he wants to see without being seen. His eyes tracked the road through the trees, a black SUV, moving slowly along the gravel approach to the cabin, its dark windows reflecting the morning light like blank, unreadable eyes. The vehicle slowed, stopped, sat there for 10 seconds with the engine running. Then it reversed, turned, and drove back down toward town. Colton watched until the sound of the engine faded completely. Then he looked at Coda, who was still standing at rigid attention by the window, and placed one hand on the dog's head. "Bleib," he said softly. "Stay." Coda held his position for 3 more seconds, then exhaled and relaxed by degrees, ears softening, tail lowering, weight shifting back onto his haunches, but his eyes stayed on the window. Nora stood behind the table, her hand flat on the closed laptop, her face still. "They know I'm here." "They've known since you checked into the inn," Colton said. He turned from the window. The room, and now this. They're watching. "What do we do?" Colton looked at the files on the table, at the letter, at the dog, at the woman who had driven 600 miles because her dead brother told her to find him. "We finish it," he said, "and then we make sure the right people see it." Nora held his gaze. "Jack forgave you," she said. The words came out quiet, steady, aimed with the precision of a woman who knew exactly where to place them. "When are you going to forgive yourself?" Colton did not answer, but he did not turn away either. He stood in the kitchen of the cabin he had been hiding in for 3 years, and for the first time since the night the hallway exploded, he did not leave the room. Dominic Hale arrived in Laurel Creek on a Thursday morning, driving a silver sedan that cost more than most of the houses on Main Street. Colton was at the Copper Kettle when Hale walked in. He had chosen the seat deliberately, the counter stool that faced the door, the one Maggie said he always used. Coda lay beneath the counter at his feet, invisible to anyone entering, but positioned with a clear line to the door. Colton held a mug of black coffee in his right hand and waited. The door opened. The brass bell above it chimed once. A man in his early 50s stepped inside, tall, square-shouldered, wearing a dark sport coat over a pressed shirt with no tie. His hair was close-cropped silver, and his face carried the kind of tan that came from golf courses and outdoor conferences rather than field work. He moved with the confident ease of a man accustomed to entering rooms and finding them rearranged to accommodate him. His eyes found Colton immediately. Hale crossed the cafe with unhurried steps and sat on the stool beside him. He did not offer his hand. He did not smile. He ordered coffee from Maggie with a polite nod that suggested he had spent decades practicing the art of appearing harmless in rooms where he was anything but. Beneath the counter, Coda's growl was barely audible, a low, continuous tremor that vibrated through the floor like a wire pulled taut. The dog's nose was working, pulling in the stranger's scent, cataloging it, filing it in whatever archive a German Shepherd maintains for the category of people who trigger the oldest and most reliable alarm system evolution ever designed. "Jack's dog," Hale said, looking down. "He always talked about that mutt. Said it was smarter than half the platoon." He raised his eyes to Colton. "It's been a long time, Chief." Colton said nothing. He set his mug down and turned on the stool so that his body faced Hale directly. His hands were loose at his sides. His breathing was even. Everything about his posture communicated a single, unmistakable message. I am here, I am not leaving, and I see you exactly as you are. I'll save us both the small talk, Hale said. He lowered his voice to a register that did not carry past the two of them. I know what the Mercer girl found. I know what's in those files. And I know you've been making calls to people who might take an interest. He paused. You're a good man, Briggs. Don't let a dead man's letter ruin a living man's life. The words were calm, measured, delivered with the same smooth precision that had probably served Hale well in boardrooms and briefing rooms and every other room where the currency was power and the exchange rate was silence. Colton studied the man beside him the way he had studied 1,000 rooms in 1,000 buildings in 12 countries. Not with emotion, but with the cold, analytical patience of an operator assessing a situation. Threat level, capability, exits. That dead man, Colton said quietly, was my brother. Something shifted in Hale's expression. A flicker. Not guilt, not fear. Calculation. The quick, involuntary adjustment of a man whose primary variable had just changed value. He was mine, too, Hale said. In a different way. No, Colton said. He wasn't. The silence between them could have been measured in heartbeats. Maggie stood behind the counter with a pot of coffee in her hand, her eyes moving between the two men with the instinct of a woman who had been reading the weather in her cafe for 30 years and knew the difference between a conversation and a storm. Hale tried once more. The original brief was wrong, Briggs. I'd walked that sector the week before. There was nothing there. The threat assessment was overstated, and I adjusted it based on what I saw on the ground. He held Colton's gaze. I was wrong. I'll carry that. But I wasn't trying to get anyone killed. And after? Colton said. When you knew what happened. When Jack was dead and the platoon was torn apart, and you had a choice between coming forward and walking away. Hale was silent. You didn't just walk away, Colton said. You built a company. You took contracts from the same people who managed the region. You sat on boards and gave speeches and let a senior chief carry the weight for 3 years because his guilt was more convenient than your truth. The calculation in Hale's eyes shifted again, from assessment to something harder. Think carefully about what you're doing, Chief. Some things are better left where they are. Colton met his gaze and held it. I spent 3 years believing I killed my best friend. You let me believe it. And you got paid. We're done thinking carefully. Hale stood. He buttoned his sport coat with deliberate precision, the way a man adjusts his armor before stepping onto a field. He looked at Colton one more time, a long, measuring look that took in the stool, the coffee, the dog beneath the counter, and the quiet, immovable certainty of a man who had walked point in the darkest places on Earth and was not going to flinch from a civilian in a sport coat. You're making a mistake, Hale said. Wouldn't be the first time, Colton replied. But this one I can live with. Hale left. The brass bell chimed behind him. The silver sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared down Main Street. Maggie set a fresh cup of coffee in front of Colton without being asked. On the house, she said, and moved away. Friend of yours? No. She studied him for a moment, then nodded once and moved on to the next customer with the quiet understanding of a woman who knew when not to ask the second question. Beneath the counter, Coda exhaled and set his chin on Colton's boot. His body was still tense, still tracking the door, but the growl had stopped. The threat had left the room. The handler was still here. The math was acceptable. Hail struck 2 days later.
Nora was at the Copper Kettle, working through a final summary of the evidence package she and Colton had assembled. Jack's notes, the official reports, her own analysis of Hale's corporate timeline, the paper trail she had traced through public filings. The manila envelope sat on the table beside her laptop, thick with documentation that told a story 3 years overdue. The cafe was half full with the Saturday morning crowd. Retirees nursing coffee, a young couple with a baby in a high chair, Maggie moving between tables with the coffee pot and the easy chatter that kept the room alive. Nora had taken the corner booth, her back to the wall, a habit she had unconsciously adopted from watching Colton. 2 men entered through the front door. They were not from Laurel Creek. That much was obvious in the way they moved, scanning the room without the casual familiarity of regulars, their eyes finding Nora with the directional precision of people who had been told exactly where to look. Both were in their 40s, fit, wearing dark jackets that suggested a professional detachment from the small-town surroundings. They were not armed, or at least not visibly, but they carried themselves with the physical confidence of men who were accustomed to rooms doing what they wanted. They sat down across from Nora without being invited. "Ms. Mercer," the first one said. He smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Virginia roads are dangerous in the fall. Lot of curves, lot of blind spots. A woman driving alone? Things can happen." He folded his hands on the table. "Mr. Hale thinks it would be wise for you to head home. Enjoy the rest of the season somewhere safer." Nora's fingers stopped on the keyboard. Her heart rate spiked, but her expression remained controlled. The mask of a woman who had faced hostile witnesses across a courtroom table and understood that the first person to show fear conceded the ground. "I appreciate the concern," she said. Her voice was steady. "But I'm not finished here." The second man leaned forward. "You should be." At the counter, Maggie had stopped pouring coffee. Her hand rested on the phone beneath the register. The front door opened again. Colton entered the Copper Kettle the way he entered every room, shoulders square, eyes already moving, cataloging the geometry of the space in the time it took most people to notice the chalkboard menu. Coda walked at his left side, off-leash, the dog's posture transformed from the lazy companion of a morning walk into something rigid and alert. The fur along Coda's spine had risen into a dark ridge, and the growl that came from his chest was not the low vibration he had used with Hale. This was louder, harder, a sound that carried across the cafe and turned every head in the room. Colton's assessment took 2 seconds. 2 men, corner booth, facing Nora, hands visible, posture aggressive but controlled, no visible threat in their hands. Nora's laptop open, her back to the wall, her face pale but composed. He crossed the room without hurrying. Coda matched his stride, the dog's eyes locked on the 2 men with an intensity that made the nearer one shift in his seat. Colton reached the booth and did something that surprised everyone in the room. He sat down, not beside Nora, across from the 2 men. He slid into the booth with the unhurried calm of a man joining friends for breakfast and set his hands flat on the table where they could be seen. Coda positioned himself at the end of the booth, blocking the exit, his body angled toward the two strangers with the coiled precision of a dog who understood exactly what he was guarding and why.
"Gentlemen," Colton said. His voice was low, measured, each word delivered with the controlled clarity of a man who had spent 2 decades giving orders in places where being misunderstood could cost lives. "You're going to stand up. You're going to walk out that door. And you're going to tell Hale that the next conversation about this won't be with me. It'll be with people who carry badges." The first man opened his mouth to speak. "I wasn't asking," Colton said. The room was silent. The baby in the high chair had gone still. The retirees at the counter had stopped mid-sip. Maggie's hand was still on the phone. The two men looked at each other, looked at Coda, whose growl had not stopped, whose amber eyes had not blinked, whose body communicated the oldest and simplest message in the animal kingdom: move wrong and find out. They looked at Colton, at the set of his jaw, the flat calm in his eyes, the hands that rested on the table with a stillness that only seemed relaxed. The first man stood. The second followed. They straightened their jackets with the self-conscious precision of men trying to preserve dignity in a room that had already made its judgment, and they walked to the door. The brass bell chimed twice as they left. Through the window, Nora watched them climb into a dark SUV and pull away from the curb. The cafe exhaled. Maggie set the phone down and placed a fresh mug of coffee in front of Colton. "On the house," she said, and moved away. Colton looked at Coda. The dog was still standing, still focused on the door, the ridge of fur along his spine still raised. "Good boy," Colton said, his voice dropping into the soft register that belonged only to the dog. "Platz." Coda held his position for one more beat, his own assessment, his own all clear, and then lowered himself to the floor beside the booth, his eyes still on the door, but his breathing beginning to slow. From the corner booth near the window, an elderly woman with white hair and a cardigan buttoned to the collar began to clap, slowly, deliberately. A quiet, rhythmic applause that carried more approval than a standing ovation. She smiled at Colton with the serene satisfaction of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know a good man when one sat down. Colton shook his head once, a small motion, almost imperceptible, and turned back to Nora. "You all right?" "Yes." Her voice was thinner than she wanted it to be, but it held. "Thank you." He nodded. Then his expression changed, not softening exactly, but shifting, as though a door had opened behind his eyes, and something that had been standing on the other side for a long time had finally stepped through. A memory surfaced. Not a flashback, not the violent sensory intrusion of the corridor. Something gentler. Jack, the night before the last op, standing beside Colton in the staging area, his hand on Colton's shoulder, his voice steady and certain in the way that only Jack's voice had ever been. "Whatever happens in there, we walk out together." Colton looked at Nora, at the woman who had driven 600 miles because her dead brother told her to find him, at the woman who had sat in a booth while 2 men threatened her and had not stood up, at the woman whose wound matched his own, shaped differently but stored in the same place. "We walk out together," he said. Nora's eyes filled. She did not look away. She understood, not because he had explained, but because some things do not require explanation. They require only the willingness to be understood. Colton's phone buzzed on the table, a message from the friend who had made the calls. Package delivered. They're looking into it. Hale doesn't know it yet, but his war is over. Colton read the message, set the phone face down on the table, looked at Coda, who had rested his chin on the booth seat and was watching him with the patient, steady gaze of a dog who had been waiting 3 years for his handler to come back from wherever he had gone. "Let's go home," Colton said. The days that followed were quiet in the way that the world is quiet after something heavy has been set down. Colton woke before dawn, the same as always, ran the ridge trail with Coda, the same as always. The left knee clicked on the uphill. The right shoulder loosened after the third set of pull-ups. The routine had not changed, but the man inside the routine had shifted. The way the foundation of a house shifts after years of settling. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that the doors hang differently and the light falls through the windows at a new angle. The federal investigation moved at the speed of institutions, which is to say, slowly and with paperwork. Colton had done his part. He had handed the evidence to people whose job it was to follow the trail, and he had stepped back. He was not a prosecutor. He was not an investigator. He was a retired senior chief who built bookshelves and ran with his dog. And for the first time, that description did not feel like a diminishment. On the 5th morning, Colton took the letter to the ridge. He and Coda reached the overlook just as the sun crested the eastern ridge, turning the valley into a bowl of gold and copper, and the particular shade of amber that the Blue Ridge Mountains produce for exactly 3 weeks every October before the leaves surrender and the world goes gray. The air was cold enough to see his breath. The town below was still asleep. No sound except the wind in the bare oaks and the distant call of a hawk riding the thermals above the valley. Colton sat on the flat rock at the edge of the clearing. Coda sat beside him, shoulder against knee, the contact as automatic and essential as breathing. The letter was in Colton's jacket pocket, folded along the same creases Jack's hands had made. He took it out and opened it, read it one more time, not for the information, which he had memorized, but for the voice, for the cadence that was Jack's and no one else's, for the sentence about Coda and the socks, for the dry joke about the hammer, for the last line, the one that Jack had borrowed from whatever quiet faith lived inside him and had worn as lightly as he wore everything else. God keeps the ones he needs close. Colton read the postscript aloud. His voice carried across the empty clearing and disappeared into the trees. I think that includes stubborn senior chiefs who don't know when to stop blaming themselves. He looked at the sky. The color was changing from silver to blue, the stars fading one by one like lights being turned off in a house. Somewhere above the ridgeline, the hawk called again, sharp, clean, certain. I don't know if you can hear me, Colton said. He was not speaking to the sky. He was not speaking to the hawk. He was speaking to the man who had written the letter, and to the God that man had believed in, and to the part of himself that had been locked in a corridor for 3 years and was only now finding the door. But I'm trying. That's all I've got. His voice broke on the last word. Not dramatically, not the way voices break in stories, the way they break in real life. A small fracture, barely audible, that splits the surface of the thing a man has been holding together and lets something warm and raw and terrifying leak through. For the first time since Jack's death, Colton Briggs did not stop the tears. They came silently, the way they come for men who have been trained to endure things that should not be endured, not with sobs, not with sound, but as a steady, quiet leak from a reservoir that had been filling for 3 years and had simply, finally, reached the point where containment was no longer possible. Coda leaned into him. The dog's head rested against Colton's thigh, his amber eyes half closed, his breathing slow and deep. He did not whimper. He did not paw. He simply pressed his body closer and stayed, the way he had stayed every night by the door, except that now he was not waiting for someone to come back. He was telling the person beside him that he was already here. They sat on the rock for a long time while the sun climbed and the valley warmed and the last of the mist burned off the low ground. The letter rested on Colton's knee, the handwriting catching the light. Then Nora's voice came from the trail behind them. "Room for one more?" Colton turned. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her jacket zipped to the chin, her hands in her pockets, her dark hair catching the gold light of the morning. She had walked up the ridge trail. He could see the mud on her boots and the slight flush in her cheeks from the climb. And she had stopped at a distance that gave him the choice. Come closer or stay away. His call. Colton looked at her for a long moment. Then he shifted on the rock. A small motion, 6 inches of space that had not been there before. Nora crossed the clearing and sat beside him, not close enough to touch, close enough that Coda, who lay between them, could rest his chin on both their boots at the same time. They looked at the valley together, the leaves, the town, the steeple of the old stone church catching the light the way it did every morning, patient and unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world. "I'm going back to Richmond next week," Nora said after a while. "Pack up a few things at the apartment, close out some files at the firm. Then I'm coming back." Colton did not look at her. He looked at the valley. "You don't have to. I know." 2 words. The same 2 words she had used the day she arrived, when he told her he did not talk about it. The same weight, the same quiet refusal to be turned away, but this time with something warmer beneath them. Not stubbornness, but choice. The deliberate, clear-eyed choice of a woman who had found the place she wanted to be and the person she wanted to be there with, and was not going to pretend otherwise. Colton reached down and rested his hand on Coda's back. The dog's tail moved once against the rock, one slow, steady thump that echoed faintly across the clearing. Then Nora's hand found his, not reaching for it, just arriving beside it, the way her car had arrived at the end of the gravel road, with purpose, without fanfare, as though it had always been heading there, and had simply taken longer than expected. Colton looked at their hands on the rock, side by side. Hers was smaller, the fingers long and precise, the nails short and clean from years of turning pages in courtrooms and veterinary records and the legal pads that organized her world. His was broad, scarred across the knuckles, the calluses thick from hammers and pull-up bars, and the particular kind of grip that comes from holding on to things. Ropes, weapons, the side of a fast-moving boat, as though letting go were a form of failure. He did not pull away. His fingers closed over hers, gently, the way a man picks up something fragile that he has been afraid to touch, not because it might break, but because holding it might mean acknowledging that he needed it. 3 people sat on a hilltop as the sun rose over the blue ridge. None of them were whole. All of them were still here. A week passed, then another. October softened into the last breath of autumn, the kind of weather the mountains produce when they are tired of performing and ready to rest. The leaves that had not yet fallen hung in the still air like old gold coins, and the mornings carried a chill that turned the mist in the valley to something that looked like silk stretched between the ridges. Colton was on the porch, fitting a new railing post into the bracket he had mounted the day before. The wood was red oak, cut from a tree that had come down in last winter's ice storm. Good grain, straight, the kind of wood that takes a finish and holds it. He worked with the quiet concentration that the task required, and nothing more, his hands moving through the familiar sequence of measure, cut, fit, fasten. Coda lay in the patch of morning sun that fell across the porch boards, his body stretched full length, his legs extended behind him, his chin resting on the warm wood. His eyes were closed, not the restless, twitching closure of the nightmares, but the deep, even stillness of a dog who was, at last, simply sleeping. Colton noticed. He had noticed last night too, and the night before. For 3 years, Coda had slept by the bedroom door, his nose pressed to the gap, his body positioned as a sentinel between the hallway and the room where the man who smelled like his first owner did not come. Every night, the same post. Every morning, the same reluctant departure when the routine pulled him into the day. Last night, Coda had not slept by the door. He had slept on the porch, the new porch, with the new railing, in the spot where the morning sun would find him first. He had padded outside after Colton locked up, circled 3 times on the boards, the ancient ritual turning that dogs perform before they settle, the gesture that says, "This place is mine, and I am choosing it," and lain down. And he had slept through the night without a single whimper. Colton looked at the dog in the sunlight and understood what it meant. He understood it the way he understood all the things that Coda said without words, through presence, through position, through the small, deliberate choices that an animal makes when language is not available and the body must speak instead. Coda was not waiting anymore. The dog had not forgotten Jack. Dogs do not forget. But somewhere in the patient, instinctive architecture of Coda's loyalty, a shift had occurred. The same kind of shift that happens when a compass needle stops searching and settles on a bearing. The door was no longer the point. The porch was. The sun was. The sound of a hammer, the smell of fresh-cut oak, the steady presence of the man who had kept a promise for 3 years and was finally learning that keeping it did not require staying broken. Maggie Holt walked past the cabin on her morning route. She lived half a mile up the road and walked into town every day, rain or shine, because she said the mountain air kept her young and the gossip kept her sharp. She paused at the fence line, set a paper bag on the post, and raised one hand in a wave without stopping. The bag, Colton knew without looking, would contain muffins. Blueberry. Maggie had been leaving them every few days since the morning at the Copper Kettle, and she had never once asked for an explanation, a thank you, or a conversation about it. She simply left them, the way people in small towns leave things, as evidence that someone noticed, and that noticing was enough. Colton lifted a hand in return. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it was there. Inside the cabin, the kitchen table held two objects. The first was a wallet, worn leather, resting beside the coffee mug. Inside it, tucked in the pocket behind his driver's license, was the trident, the gold insignia that marked a man as a Navy SEAL, the eagle clutching the anchor and the trident and the flintlock pistol that together formed the symbol he had earned at 20 years old and had carried against his chest ever since. He had not taken it out of the wallet. He had not put it away. It was still there, still his, still part of the story. But for the first time, it was not the only chapter. The second object was Jack's letter. Colton had folded it along the original creases and placed it in the table's single drawer, not hidden, not displayed, set down. The way you set down a weight you have carried for a long time, not because it no longer matters, but because your arms have finally learned that carrying it is not the same as honoring it. He closed the drawer and went back to the porch. The afternoon light stretched long across the clearing when the sound of tires on gravel came through the trees. Colton was in the chair, a mug of coffee cooling beside him. Coda lay at his feet, chin on paws. Both of them heard the engine at the same time, Coda's ears rotating, Colton's hand pausing on the armrest. And both of them knew, before the vehicle appeared through the break in the oaks, who it was. The car came up the drive with a layer of road dust on the windshield and a stack of boxes visible through the rear window. It stopped in the clearing beside the cabin, and the engine cut. Coda stood. His tail began to wag, not the controlled, measured wag he used for strangers, but the full, sweeping motion that started at the base of his spine and traveled through his entire body. He padded down the porch steps and crossed the clearing toward the car, his pace quickening with each stride until he was moving at a jog, his ears forward, his mouth open in the wide, panting expression that is as close as a German shepherd comes to a smile. Nora opened the driver's door, and Coda was there, pressing his head into her hands, his tail sweeping the gravel in wide arcs, the whimper in his throat high and urgent and full of something that had no translation except the obvious one. Colton did not stand up immediately. He sat in the chair and watched. The dog, the woman, the October light turning the clearing gold, the boxes in the back seat that meant she had done what she said she would do. She had gone back. She had packed. She had come back. He stayed in the chair for one more breath, not because he was uncertain, because the moment deserved to be held, the way you hold the last note of a song before the silence takes it, not to delay the ending, but to acknowledge that something has been completed. Then he stood and he walked down the steps, and Coda was between them, looking up at Colton, then at Nora, then at Colton again, his tail never stopping, his body vibrating with the ancient, uncomplicated joy of a dog who has finally, after 3 years of waiting, found everyone he needs in the same place at the same time. Colton looked at Nora. She looked back at him. Her eyes were bright, and her hair was wind-tangled from the drive, and she was smiling in the way she had smiled the first time she heard Jack's letter read aloud. Not happy, not sad, but something that contained both and was larger than either. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," she said. "Where else would I be?" It was the most words he had offered without being asked. 5 words, and they carried the weight of every wall he had built and every door he had closed, and the slow, difficult, still unfinished process of learning that letting someone in was not the same as letting the past out. Coda barked once, a short, sharp sound that split the quiet of the clearing like an exclamation point at the end of a sentence the dog had been writing for 3 years. Then he turned and ran back toward the porch, circled the spot where the sun hit the boards, and lay down. He rested his chin on his paws and closed his eyes. The afternoon light fell across his coat, turning the black and tan into something warm and luminous. His breathing slowed. His tail gave one final thump against the wood and went still. He was not waiting by the door. He was not listening for footsteps that would never come. He was lying in the sun, on a porch that smelled like fresh-cut oak and coffee, and the 2 people who were standing in the clearing below. And he was resting. Colton Briggs was not fixed. He might never be. The knee would still click on the hills. The shoulder would still stiffen in the cold. The dreams would still come, some nights. And Coda would still be there when they did, pressing his nose to a hand in the dark, saying the only thing that needed saying. But for the first time in 3 years, Colton was not waiting for the past to stop hurting. He was choosing to let the future in. And the dog who had waited by the door every night for a dead man to come home, finally had someone to run toward.